This lecture is about how we grow food in the U.S. and how it affects our environment. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed problems with our food system that we had either ignored or been unaware of. If you remember, long lines formed outside food pantries. Some stores had excess food supplies while others had empty shelves, and we saw that a crisis such as this could easily disrupt our food supply. For this chapter, our learning outcomes include describing the true cost of food for humans and our environment, talking about what the challenge is in feeding the human population, how did we get where we are in terms of how we currently grow food, how do we raise animals, and what are some of the impacts of that. Some strategies for pest and weed management. We're going to talk a little bit about genetically modified organisms, or GMO, and then some solutions such as sustainable agriculture and how it can be achieved. The bottom line is that we do produce enough food to feed the world's population, but still 820 million people go hungry every day. The industrial agriculture, which we're going to talk about, and the Green Revolution helped fight hunger, but they had some unintended consequences. Genetically modified crops, or GMOs, might help increase our productivity, but in the long run, it's going to take a combination of agricultural reforms and also social and economic reforms to solve the world's hunger. Food comes with hidden costs. Food production impacts our health, our environment, and the people who grow the food and get it to our shelves. In 2019, Americans spent $1.1 trillion on food. Now that cost includes producing the food, processing it, retailing it, wholesaling it, and wholesaling it. But if we look more closely at how food is produced, we will see that what we pay at the grocery store does not even come close to what it costs to produce this food. The costs do not include the present and future costs to water pollution, or the costs from air pollution, reduced biodiversity, the greenhouse gas emissions and the resulting climate change, and the cost of health care for millions of people who become ill from the types of diet that our food promotes. If these costs are included, the true cost of food in the U.S. is 3 times as much, about $3 trillion a year. So again, what we paid for food in 2019 was $1.1 trillion, but what it actually cost was $3.2 trillion. We pay that high cost even if we don't see it in the checkout line. In addition, the cost of food disproportionately affects people of color, who are more likely to suffer from diet-related diseases like obesity or malnutrition, have less access to clean food and clean water, and often work in food production jobs for less than a living wage. If we don't change our food system, future generations will pay those high costs also. The COVID pandemic revealed how unfit our food system is for the 21st century. Understanding the true cost of our food system helps us move forward in improving it and decreasing the negative impacts on our environment. So let's take a look at how we produce food in this country and how we got here. During most of the human species' 200,000 years on Earth, we have been hunter-gatherers. That means we have been dependent on wild plants and animals for food. Food supplies were limited, and so that limited our population growth. But about 10,000 years ago, as the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, humans went from being hunter-gatherers to farmers who domesticated wild animals. This is what we call the agricultural revolution. Okay, the agricultural revolution. From archaeology, we know that agriculture was invented independently in at least 5 different parts of the world. The earliest evidence was here in the Fertile Crescent, which is part of the Middle East. at least 10,500 years ago. And foods that originated from this area included wheat, barley, rye, peas, lentils, onions, garlics, carrots, grapes, and even domesticated goats and sheep. Then, about 9,500 years ago in China, they started cultivating different types of rice, millet, and pigs. In Africa, coffee and yams and other things were developed. And in the Americas, corn, beans, squash, and other products were cultivated. People began to intentionally plant seeds which grew bigger and tastier foods, and in this way, selective breeding of plants began. Selective breeding is when people choose crops and animals with desirable traits, and those are the ones that they breed. As food supplies became more stable, the carrying capacity increased and the population rose too. And from this, societies developed. So for thousands of years, traditional agriculture reigned. Growing crops with human and animal muscle power happened, and also simple tools. And this resulted in a small amount of excess food produced. Now let's jump ahead to the Industrial Revolution, which was between 1750 and 1850. People started using fossil fuels for their machines to farm instead of humans and animals, and the age of industrial agriculture began. So again, farming methods now relied on fossil fuel. The Food Agricultural Organization of the UN has estimated that about 2 teaspoons of diesel oil or equal to the work done by a man in one day. So in other words, the amount of work done by one man in one day using simple tools could be done with just 2 teaspoons of diesel oil in a much shorter period of time. So industrial agriculture relied on fossil fuels, but it also relied on chemical pesticides and synthetic fertilizers. The result was food was being produced on a large scale, and it also increased productivity and profits. Along with more food being produced, there also came clothing and an increase in housing. Medicines started to be developed, such as antibiotics and vaccines. And there was better sanitation, meaning clean water. Fewer people were dying. And so the population increased, as did the carrying capacity. Then, around 1940, the scientist Norman Borlaug came along. And he began what was known as the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution used new technologies and came up with these high-yielding crops, or as they're known, high-yielding varieties. High-yielding varieties are developed by crossing different types of plants so that the plants that resulted grew faster, produced more product, and were more resistant to disease. And an example of these types of plants were rice, maize, and wheat. The Green Revolution also required intensive irrigation. So these new farming practices were introduced to the developed world. In fact, Norman Borlaug introduced it to Mexico first, where they tripled their wheat production. Next, India adopted it, and they transformed from a country where they had lots of poverty to a country where they had so much food they were exporting it. Similar results happened in Pakistan. And so if we take a look at this graph, this is showing you on the x-axis the years, and on the y-axis is the growth level relative to the 1961 levels. Okay, so the growth of these different products, vegetables, fruits, grains, roots, and tubers, relative to what they grew in 1961. And what you can clearly see is there's an increase in almost everything. So the greatest increase is in fruits and vegetables, which you can see by this green line. The Green Revolution resulted in a 100% increase in global food production and a 20% decrease in famine between 1960 and 1990. So this is a positive thing. Industrial agriculture had a lot of benefits. First of all, there were higher yields per acre. People were able to grow crops in nutrient-poor soil because of the fertilizers. The crops had fewer blemishes on it, from pesticides, so you didn't have holes or discoloration because of insects. You could grow the crops in areas that didn't even have that much rain because of irrigation. There was higher efficiency in growing crops due to monoculture, which are basically just growing one type of crop. There was less labor and reduced poverty. But there were also some negatives that were not foreseen with industrial agriculture. For example, loss of genetic diversity, pesticide resistance. Insects began to become resistant to pesticides. Toxic chemical exposure, loss of soil fertility, depleted water supply, something called salinization of soil, water pollution, increased use of fossil fuels, which contribute to climate change, and then fewer jobs for farm workers and actually family farms. So let's take a look at some of these problems, and we're going to start with the problem of loss of biological diversity, okay? So first of all, industrial farmers grew monocultures. What is a monoculture? Well, monoculture is when only one type of crop is grown. And so all the plants are genetically alike. Okay, all the plants are genetically alike. The result is a loss in genetic diversity. Now, you might remember from previous chapters, we talked about genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. But genetic diversity is when there are a variety of genes for a particular trait. So when there is a variety of genes for a particular trait within a population. For example, let's think of apples. So there are a variety of different types of apples. And let's pick a trait, color. Some apples are red, some of them are green, some of them are yellow. That would be an example of genetic diversity. So when there is less genetic diversity, plants become more susceptible to disease, because when there's a lot of genetic diversity, there's a possibility that one of the organisms will be resistant to the disease and the others won't. But the ones that are will pass on their trait, and then there'll be more of those species or those organisms that are resistant to disease. But when everybody has the same genes for a particular trait, the crops are much more vulnerable to pests and to resistance. Basically, what kills or damages one plant is going to kill them all. The other thing is they become less resilient to changes brought about by climate change, such as changing temperatures, shorter growing seasons, destructions from floods and droughts. And an example of this is coffee. Coffee is the second most traded product in the world after petroleum. Coffee productivity is declining. It's 50% lower in some parts of the world. And that's because the highlands where the trees are growing is getting warmer and drier. And coffee doesn't grow well in those conditions. It's estimated that the area suitable to grow the two most popular types of coffee, which are Arabica and Robusta, are going to be cut in half by 2050. Now, there is research going on to try to find climate resilient varieties of coffee for the future. However, when you have a monoculture and you have a loss of genetic diversity, that is very difficult.